Biztech's Technology Show. Today we have Angus McDougall. He's the Regional Vice President of Asia Pacific at Entrust. Entrust Corporation provides identity and data security solutions used to protect identities, payments, and data. It's a privately held company based in Minnesota in the US and employs more than 2,500 people globally. Now tell us more, welcome back to Biztech Asia, Angus.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be back here again. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Now, Angus, for a start, it's been 20 months since you've been on Biztech Asia. A lot has changed because that was the tail end of the pandemic. And so how has the business changed for Entrust since then?
Yeah, it's been an interesting period in the 20 months since we last spoke. Certainly our core mission around providing the infrastructure for trust identities, payments, and data protection, that hasn't changed. That's remained much the same. We continue to embark upon our growth strategy of growing organically as we grow through the Asian countries with increased headcount and increased physical presences in different locations. But at the same time, we're also very engaged in undertaking acquisitions and fueling our growth through acquisition and broadening our product portfolios as time goes on. So the whole intent, Brian, is to drive progress for our customers in terms of digital first and making sure that people can make that progress in their digital journeys and providing the requisite infrastructure. As you know, we've come from a long and proud tradition. Now in 2024, it'll be 55 years, in fact, since we were first formed to provide payments and identity credentials back in Minneapolis in the United States. And so since that time, obviously, there's been an extraordinary amount of evolution with our company broadening our base from traditional electromechanical solutions and platforms towards more of the digital-based solutions. And that's very important. As time goes on, consumer behavior changes and it's changed dramatically. And that's really part of our discussion today to explore how that's been changing.
Now, here's an interesting thing. Over the pandemic, and so I was thinking about when we last spoke and how the pandemic was really shaping strategies. If we look at financial services companies, banks and insurance companies, they really upped their game during the pandemic because they had to find digital ways to engage their customers. And this was a global phenomenon. And obviously then security became topmost priority for many of them because increased access points, not only to customers, but also a distributed workforce. Talk us through some of the things that have happened since then and how Entrust has been involved in that.
Well, one of the key ways we've been involved, and since we last spoken, we formed an institute called the Entrust Cybersecurity Institute at the tail end of 2022. And this organization was designed, it's almost like a think tank, which is designed for us to reach out to various customer groups around the world, not just in the United States, but in all countries around the world, get that pan-regional view and understand what consumers are looking for in terms of payments and identity in the core markets that we serve. So that institute was formed, has since undertaken a number of different reports which have been released to the marketplace. And one of the most recent ones was what's called the Digital First Banking Report. And this followed on one that was released earlier this year, which was named the Future of Identity. So these sorts of reports are coming out periodically. They're designed to give a global view. I mentioned that not just taking into consideration the preferences of United States consumers, but also those in different parts of the world. So Singapore was included as part of this study, and it was designed to understand what are people looking for in their transactional journeys with particularly financial institutions in our part of the world. Very interesting, as you say, is post-pandemic, how has behavior changed? You know, one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, Brian, there was an aggressive and accelerated move towards contactless transactions. So the sorts of things where consumers simply didn't want to be involved with keying in 4-digit PIN codes because they didn't want their fingers to touch what could potentially be a contaminated surface. So tap and go became even more ubiquitous during the pandemic. contactless payments and the ability for consumers to undertake those sorts of transactions in a seamless, safe, and secure way became even more ubiquitous. So these sorts of things are what we're determined to understand, how consumer behavior is changing, and how we can adapt our platforms to respond to the needs of the market.
So what were some of the other key findings from that report? So I understand that report, you surveyed 1,000 customers in 4 countries.
That's right. And again, trying to get a pan-regional view of what people are looking for. So those countries were 1, the United States, 2, France to represent the European markets, 3, Chile to represent the Latin American countries, and finally Singapore. And so consumers were sequestered and questioned on their behavior in regards to how to undertake transactions. And one of the areas we try and focus on to try and get some very specific level of feedback from people was focusing on key areas. So one that we find is becoming quite top of mind for the banks at the moment is the ability to open a new transactional account digitally. What are people looking for in this sort of requirement, in this sort of area? And so there were some interesting findings that came out of that. First of all, what is key is that to start with what banks are looking for, and what is all important is that banks are looking for top of wallet awareness from their banking customers. So in other words, when you go to undertake a transaction, you may have multiple choices of financial institutions or fintechs in your wallet to undertake that transaction. Which one will you choose? And that could be based on many, many different factors. So that means the banks are in a battle with not just their traditional rivals, but also new entrants to the market to maintain that share of wallet and to make sure they obtain the customer's mind share in undertaking transactions.
And Angus, if I want to interrupt you here, let me interrupt you here at this point. I think especially in the Asia Pacific region, with the mushrooming of neobanks and digital banks across the region, traditional banks really are up against it, because as you pointed out, as this study pointed out, the key challenge is also to onboard people to open new accounts easily, digitally, without going to a physical branch.
That's true. But I think what's also important and what has become apparent is that a true omni-channel experience is expected by customers. They want security, they want convenience. And oftentimes they're prepared to sacrifice going to a branch to undertake certain transactions, which may be more complex. Now, having said that, from the report, in Singapore, for example, I think it was close to 79% of people said they want to do everyday transactions digitally. And even an equal proportion of people said they're happy to do those on mobile apps on their phone. But in other words, they're prepared to, they want convenience, but they want security, not at the expense of security. And for more complex transactions, they're happy to go to a branch. So what this means is that the bank must have an obvious omni-channel approach to this. What works best for their customer base? It could be having the customers venture into the branch. It could be undertaking the transactions on a self-service platform, or it could be a fully digital experience in that particular transaction.
Now, one of the key things then that comes to mind is also the fact that with, especially in the last 2 years, the increased threats associated with cybersecurity, how are companies like Entrust helping these financial institutions basically address the trust needs that customers are really looking for?
Yes. Well, this is some of the things that we've been working on to expand our portfolio of security platforms. It's been very important. And I think we talked about last time in late 2019 that we acquired a company called Encipher, which is very prominent in the world of what we call HSMs, hardware security modules, which is the encryption process of data streams. So in other words, allowing the data streams to be protected from access by potential bad actors. So that's one consideration. The other consideration, one we've undertaken, is the access to a new platform called Entrust Verified Signing, which is an infrastructure to provide the degree of trust between two parties undertaking a transaction and ensuring all the requisite trust infrastructure is in place to ensure the transaction goes through securely. So there's a number of different elements to this, Brian, but certainly one that we're constantly in a race to understand what the market is looking for and then delivering these sorts of platforms that can meet the expectations of consumers.
Now, speaking of the race, it's also the race to beat the bad guys, and it's a constant cat and mouse game. Artificial intelligence is now the new element particularly in the last year or two, which has changed the game from a cybersecurity perspective. Walk us through some of the challenges and how perhaps a company like you is helping financial institutions do it to help these companies stay ahead of this game.
Well, there's no question this is going to be a significant growth area, and will really lay the foundation for the next phase of growth in the digital markets. So I was looking at a report last night, Brian, which talked about in Asia Pacific, they expect this market to grow to $78 billion by 2027, within 3 years. So this is, remember, AI hasn't been around that long. So, you know, perhaps starting from scratch 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago maximum in terms of what is, falls within the classical definition of generative artificial intelligence. Of course, we've seen a number of banks undertake these sorts of tools already. Banks like JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, increasingly using things like chatbots to provide value-added services to customers and to provide recommendations on certain investment alternatives to various people. All these sorts of things are starting to become more common. One thing that was very relevant that came out of the Digital First Banking report was that consumers, especially in Singapore, are very comfortable with banks using AI to provide another level of security against bad actors. So basically, consumers are saying, we are happy for you to use leading edge technologies to allow us to give us a greater feeling of security as to how we undertake our transactions. It's certainly become so visible, certainly in the Singapore marketplace, Brian, I'm sure in the rest of the ASEAN markets as well. The media here is doing a very good job of publicizing the potential for identity theft, for transactions that are undertaken without your knowledge, and helping people understand not to click on what could potentially be malicious links. So these sorts of things are becoming more top of mind, more visible to consumers as time goes on. And I must say, I think the Singapore industry is doing a pretty good job of trying to get the message out to people, because it is very prevalent in all forms of media each day.
But one of the challenges that we have from a financial services perspective, and again, through your Asia Pacific lens, which is your purview, is markets like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia have a high degree of awareness, a high degree also from a legal framework on how to deal with this in terms of reporting. But then there are laggard markets, particularly in ASEAN, in some markets in ASEAN, where this is not the case, and there is a lot of potential for fraud. What are your thoughts on this, and how can perhaps Entrust help some of these companies who are in these markets?
Yes. Well, there's certainly the old story around the emerging markets don't have to deal with the costs of legacy infrastructure. So we've seen, you know, the most well-documented case is that of various countries in Africa in regards to payments and how they could undertake a digital payment infrastructure in certain countries in Africa without having to worry about the traditional network that banks had invested in. There's no vested interest because it simply didn't exist in those particular countries. And as we turn our attention to the ASEAN geography, there's no question that, as you say, markets like Singapore and Hong Kong and Australia may be more advanced in terms of the legislative framework around protection for consumers. But I think it is starting to become more visible. So one of the things that people are concerned with, Brian, of course, is the protection of their data and making sure their data doesn't get leaked to bad actors. And that's certainly very top of mind for all consumers. And I think it's certainly something that we have to do a better job as an industry to provide that level of assurance to people that we're doing everything we can to protect the data, confidential data of people, and ensuring that those protections are in place. But from our perspective, we're trying to provide new security alternatives to our banking customers, make it as seamless as possible, provide assistance on their digital journey as they start to move through the process of providing omni-channel experiences to customers, and make it as seamless and secure for all as possible.
Now, Angus, it's the start of the year. It's 2024. What do we have in store for Entrust in 2024, particularly in the Asia Pacific region?
Well, Brian, we think about what an interesting year this is going to be this year. The first thing that comes to mind is the fact that this is really the year of the election. I'm not just talking about, obviously, what's happening in the United States and the United Kingdom, but also more locally in markets like Taiwan, in Japan, Indonesia, all these different countries that will, India, of course, Bangladesh most recently, all of these countries which are undertaking elections during the course of this year. So that will put in place a volatile framework for us to work within. Having said that, I think also we are facing less economic headwinds than what we were looking at the start of 21 or 22 as we came out of the back end of the COVID pandemic. We then still faced a highly inflationary environment. We faced high interest rates, all of these different dynamics which weighed upon our customers' decisions around investments. Some of those things are starting to move back into the distance. I think we enter it with a more positive economic outlook in 2024 than what was the case in 2023. Yes, we still have many hurdles to negotiate. There's no question about that. But it is looking to me to be a more sound economic framework to work within than what was the case a year or two back. So we've got to really focus on working with our customers. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of driving these new digital platforms. We've got a great legacy. We've got a tremendous base of customers within the Asia Pacific region. One of the strengths we have going for us, Brian, is the value of our brand name, and the very name itself, Entrust, incorporates the word trust and what that means to people. I think it was actually a degree of branding genius for us to change the brand back in 2016 from, as it was, DataCard in those days, to Entrust DataCard, and then 2020 to try and simplify it further by simply becoming Entrust. And this will hold us in good stead for the future. We need to be visible to people. We need to earn the right to have a seat at the table in terms of purchasing decisions. A lot of good stuff going on, and we're looking forward to the challenge ahead during 2024.
Angus, it's been a lovely conversation. Thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
Brian, it's always a pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you face to face in the very near future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We've been speaking to Angus McDougall. He's the Regional Vice President, Asia Pacific for Entrust. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to Biztech's Technology Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.